Is where they actually had the first flight. They researched it. All of America has the most sustained winds, and so they actually went out there and had the technology to fly it there. If you actually look on page 37, on page 37, that ended up being their first flight, where they came in step 3, having man-powered flight. Who was the first person to fly in a plane? How successful were they? Petrovich, yes. How did they decide? They say, hey man, I worked harder than you, you do it? Yes, they had a flip of the coin, and the flip of the coin allowed them to choose Wilbur. Was his first flight very successful? Cadet Kramer. What happened in the first flight? How many miles did he fly? It's a trick question. How many miles did he fly?
852 feet, sir.
852 feet?
A mile and almost 2 miles.
No, thank you very much for playing the first flight. Could that be?
It only lasted 3.5 seconds.
3.5 seconds, okay? Wilbur crashed and burned. He crashed and made a big mistake. You read the wrong thing. And so Wilbur actually tried and didn't make it. And then it took him, 2 or 3 days to fix the accident. And then the next day, when they actually came up to fly again, who flew the second time, guys?
The other guy.
Who the other guy? Who was the other guy? Orville, yes. And how successful was he doing this? Excuse me?
He lasted 12 seconds, sir.
He went for 12 seconds, exactly. And he ended up flying long enough that they considered a complete success and landed perfectly fine, and basically had enough success to call it a complete manned flight. Okay? And there's the picture of it, at the bottom of page 37. What was the distance on the manned flight there that Orville flew?
120 feet, sir.
That was less than the length of the space shuttle. Okay, so the first absolute successful flight was less than the length of the space shuttle, and it had ended up being a pretty momentous decision. They actually wrote back to their dad and supported that they actually did it, and they had a huge success on that. Did this plane have wheels?
No, sir.
It had struts or skids, okay? They actually had a rail that they came through. And to this day, there is controversy about that. The French. You go talk to the French high school students, and you ask them who had the first manned flight, powered flight, they will say the French did. Because there was a French guy who had wheels, and he started off on a flat area, and he actually had wheeled contraption that flew. So there is kind of argument that the Wright brothers didn't have wheels to begin with because they were on sand, they couldn't have wheels. But that is, to this day, kind of some controversy about that. This is how they controlled their craft. They used a forward elevator, wing warping, and the pilot did not sit upright, he was laying down. He laid on a belly, sort of in a padded cradle, and he controlled the lever with an up and down movement with the stabilizer in front of him. And for them to come over, they had to overcome all these different principles of flight: lift, drag, thrust, center of gravity. Yes? Lifties and draggies. Yeah, you can see that in my science of flight class. That's exactly right. And recover their relative wind. The engine that they developed, and actually did Wilbur and Orville build the engine? No, they actually asked a mechanic friend of theirs. They tried to look at all the automobile engines, which were new and big and fat and heavy at the time, and no one had a light-powered one. So they had a friend, I think his name was Chuck Taylor, actually a mechanic, and he built him up a 12-horsepower engine, and they needed 90 pounds of thrust to make it happen, and they got it from a friend who built it. So he is just as much a miracle, the fact that he was lucky enough to be around Wilbur and Ogle, who figured out all the aerodynamics, and it all worked out, so they got a light-powered engine. They went to Army, and did the Army buy their stuff immediately?
No.
No! Wilbur and Ogle tried to make money on it, and the Army didn't believe that they could do it.
They said planes would never ever be used in the art of war.
That's true. We'll get to that in the Army portion of this class. You're right. And their offer was turned down. Okay? They went back and they kept offering it to the armies, and the French were actually very interested in buying their flyer. But eventually the Army, the Wright brothers made a patent to fly, try to make money out of it. Did the Wright brothers ever make money out of flying?
No, sir.
Actually, yes, they did. They actually made about $1 million, $1.5 million. Of course, in year 1912 or whatever it was, that was a huge amount of money. But of course, they did not completely get paid for everything that they could have and got invented. And so they ended up having a request and selling the flyer to the government in 1908. Remember the first flight was in what year? What year was the first flight? 1903. So look, it took a while for them to get this through to the government. And this person here, you know for your test, Lieutenant Selfridge. There is a base named Selfridge Air Force Base up in Michigan. He was the first casualty in the planes. He actually died near Washington, D.C. So, later on, they ended up teaching the first two pilots of the Air Force to fly, Lieutenant Lamb and Lieutenant Humphreys. And Foulois ended up being the third pilot. He ended up being in charge, actually, of the Army Air Corps at one time. Ended up being a major general. And finally, the Army decided that airplanes are going to work. And we covered the Army aviation in the third quarter. We'll talk about their contributions during World War I. They thought it'd only be reconnaissance, and then, of course, guess what? They started dropping bombs with it. When did Wilbur and Orville die? How long did they live? Yes, sir.
1948.
1948. Who lived in 1948? Orville, right? And so really, one of them, think about it, lived through World War II and saw us drop the nuclear bomb into the world. That's incredible. So they actually saw this invention that they came out of a bicycle shop all the way through. Wilbur ended up dying early. I think it was 1918. When did he die?
1912.
1912, yeah. So he ended up dying much younger. And I don't know what, that's a good point. How did he die? Maybe back then people died of pneumonia?
Yes, sir. He had some kind of sickness.
Sickness, yeah. And they were being challenged with their patents and lawsuits a lot. I'm not sure, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how he died.
I think lawsuits didn't exist.
Well, they were suing people who were flying, who weren't paying them to fly because they had a patent.
Oh, okay.
So there was a lot of controversy to begin.
So what if I made a plane that had nothing to do with their inventions?
Well, again, this is sort of when they were starting the patent office too, so there were a lot of lawsuits depending on how they worked on that. Okay, Vietnam War. I need to cover Vietnam War so you can actually understand Colonel Jonas coming in. Vietnam War happened as another phase of the Cold War, and basically the Geneva Accords of 1954 split Vietnam into two parallels. And you know what? Let's go. Now that I have the computer system working here, let me go and show you Vietnam. Okay, so Vietnam is in the far western part of the Pacific, on a peninsula. Ooh, what did I just do? And basically you have a North Vietnam up here on the top part and a South Vietnam down here. They had different countries around them that were not officially involved in the war, and Colonel Jonas will talk to you about that. You have Laos over here, and you have Bangkok, you have Bangkok and Thailand, as well as Cambodia, but Vietnam itself is right here on the coast, Ho Chi Minh City, up to Da Nang, and up to North Vietnam. At the time, does anyone know what country this is up here on the top? China. So when I was a kid, this is Vietnam, I was 10 years old, okay? We were always worried about China getting involved in Vietnam. And really, if you look at the history of Lyndon Johnson and our involvement, we were very worried about not doing too much to get China involved to come and be part of the war. So actually, we entered in a gradual entry, and we provided military training and supplies to the South Vietnamese. But, very quickly, the wars that started in 1964, things got heated up and ended up a huge campaign that lasted until 1973. So, and who was president in 1964? Franklin Roosevelt? Just kidding. No. Lyndon Johnson was president in 1964. 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Who was president in 1973 that got us out of Vietnam? President Nixon. Yes, he ran for the presidency saying, I will stop Vietnam. And my brother was in war over there, and guess what? My mother, who was a Democrat her whole life, voted for Nixon, who was a Republican. So at that time, the Republicans wanted to stop all the wars. Earlier, all the Democrats wanted to start all the wars. Things have changed nowadays, right? So Nixon was elected to get people out of Vietnam. He did. He did. Basically, the beginning of our Air Force was just to train the Vietnam Air Force. We did a real good job without that. The idea was we were supposed to do reconnaissance and airlift. But we ended up buying tactical air power. This is exactly what Colonel Jonas will talk about. And so, in the end, it was strategic bombing that ended up wiping out the North Vietnamese and working towards the end of the war. Operation Rolling Thunder was part of our strategic bombing of Vietnam, and this was purpose was to wear down the North Vietnamese and to provide, without provoking the Soviets and the Chinese. And the strikes gave them too much time. The Tet Offensive was something where the North Vietnamese attacked us and truly surprised us. They did a great job. We repelled them, but it ended when the United States and the South Vietnamese expelled the North Vietnamese from the South cities. So after we repelled them, it ended up being work for President Nixon. He said, I will get everybody out of Vietnam, and he ended up these huge offensive, Operation Linebacker 1 and 2, and we started bombing everybody so that everybody could come to the peace table and agree to end the war. We did, with many different bombing, the B-52s relentlessly bombed the targets that had been off limits for many years, and finally in January 73, there was a peace treaty with the United States. Did the North Vietnamese stick to the peace treaty? No. As soon as we left, they invaded and took over South Vietnam. So right now, is Vietnam a democracy?
No.
No, it's a communist state. But of course, guess what? They trade with America very well, and their actual world is much more richer because of it. All right, thank you very much. This will be ending the meeting. Why don't we go ahead and dismiss the class?
Flight, ascend, hut. Dismiss.
Go do great things!